At 3:30 in the morning on July 5, 1943, the sky over western Russia lit up, not from German artillery, but from the Red Army's own guns. The thunder rolled for miles, echoing across the fields of Kursk. In bunkers and command tents of the Wehrmacht, officers froze mid-sentence. Radios crackled with disbelief. Was this Das? They're firing first. For weeks, German commanders had been preparing Operation Citadel, Hitler's great plan to claw back the initiative lost at Stalingrad. Two massive pincers of armor, one driving from the north under General Model, the other from the south under Manstein, would meet at the city of Kursk, cutting off a bulge of Soviet forces. Hitler had promised it would be swift, precise, decisive. But that night, the earth itself seemed to turn against them. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously, their shells whistling across no man's land into German staging areas. Ammunition dumps went up like volcanoes. Fuel trucks burned bright against the dawn. One officer later wrote in his diary, "The ground was moving. The air was shaking. We thought we were being bombed from the heavens themselves." By 4 a.m., the forward elements of Germany's 9th and 4th Panzer Armies were in chaos. Infantry scattered from their assembly zones. Tanks struggled to maneuver in fields cratered by explosions. When the barrage finally ceased, a heavy, sulphurous silence fell. How could they have known? Someone whispered in the command post at Belgorod. The answer lay hundreds of miles away, in offices and radio rooms that the Germans had never seen. For months, Soviet intelligence had been reading fragments of Wehrmacht communications, aided by the mysterious Lucy ring operating out of neutral Switzerland. The Red Army knew the exact day, hour, and direction of the attack. Even before the first German tank had started its engine, Soviet engineers had already reshaped the Kursk salient into the most fortified stretch of land in Europe. Across that broad, curved front stretched layer upon layer of defense, trenches, minefields, and anti-tank ditches so deep they swallowed tanks whole. Over 1 million landmines were buried there, each one a small trap waiting to explode beneath the weight of German steel. Behind them, concealed under camouflage nets and dust, waited thousands of T-34s, dug in like predators beneath the soil. Inside a dugout near Panayrai, Colonel Sokolov of the Red Army's 13th Army listened to the distant shelling and lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "So," he murmured, "the storm begins." Around him, men waited at their guns, their faces gray with exhaustion and anticipation. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and cordite. In Berlin, meanwhile, Hitler paced before a wall map, his fingers tapping the Kursk bulge. "We will crush them," he told his staff. "This is the decisive battle. The new tanks will break their lines like paper." Those new tanks were his pride. Tigers and Panthers, the heaviest, most advanced armored vehicles ever built. 2,700 of them were massed for Citadel, gleaming with fresh paint and confidence. Yet on the eve of battle, even some German officers had doubts. General Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, had warned, "We are throwing away our best machines on a gamble we cannot afford." But Hitler had silenced him. Now, as dawn approached, those same tanks waited at the edge of the front, engines idling, ready to lunge into the Soviet defenses. Their crews, sweating inside steel hulls, heard the distant echoes of artillery and thought it was the usual prelude. They did not yet realize that the enemy already knew their every move. When the Soviet barrage finally ended, the air shimmered with smoke. German radio operators called for orders, but static filled the lines. The first light of dawn revealed a landscape churned into ash. Yet, somewhere beyond the haze, the German assault was still scheduled to begin at 5 a.m. In a forward tank unit near Orel, a young German lieutenant adjusted his headset and spoke into the mic, "All units, advance." Engines roared. The great armored columns began to move, slowly, cautiously, into the teeth of what they believed was surprise. Instead, they rolled into a battlefield that had been waiting for them for months. Above, a single Soviet reconnaissance plane traced circles through the smoke. Its pilot radioed 3 words back to headquarters: "They are coming." And so the largest armored battle in human history began, not with the swift shock of German aggression, but with a thunderclap from the Red Army. In a bunker south of Kursk, General Rokossovsky marked the time on his watch and gave a thin smile. "Let them come," he said. "We've already dug their graves." The German soldiers didn't know it yet, but they were driving straight into a labyrinth designed to consume them. Trenches that led nowhere, minefields that stretched for miles, and Soviet guns zeroed in on every approach road. The silence after the bombardment was deceptive. It felt like the world holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the first Tigers began to move, their treads grinding over broken earth, their turrets turning toward the unknown. They thought victory waited beyond the next ridge. But in that dawn haze, as the first shells whistled back from Soviet lines, even the veterans sensed something had changed. The Russians were no longer running. They were waiting. And waiting was something the Red Army had learned to do very, very well. By mid-morning, the fields around Kursk were burning again, but this time it was German fuel that fed the fire. They had planned to break the Soviet line in 3 days. In 3 days, they would be burying their dead in the smoke of their own ambition. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Dawn crept over the fields of Kursk in a haze of smoke and dust. The German engines growled like beasts waking from hibernation. Panthers and Tigers, the pride of Hitler's new armored force, rolled forward, their steel plates still smelling of factory oil. Crews inside adjusted their headsets, sweat already trickling down their faces. Then the order came through the static. Vorwärts. Forward. The 4th Panzer Army struck from the south, the 9th from the north. Between them lay the Soviet salient, a land thick with trenches, mines, and hidden guns. The Germans expected a lightning breakthrough. They got a wall of fire. The first explosion came less than a mile from the start line. A Panther hit a mine and burst into flame. Another followed, its track ripped clean off. The column stopped, jammed nose to tail. Then Soviet artillery opened up. Shells screamed across the fields, bursting among the stalled armor. The earth itself exploded, one panzer officer wrote later. Within an hour, the assault began to bog down. The ground was churned into mud and fire. Engineers ran ahead, clearing mines under constant shelling. Medics dragged the wounded through craters half filled with oil and blood. By mid-morning, the battlefield was a furnace. The smell of burning fuel clung to the air. Black smoke turned day into dusk. The new German tanks, so feared and praised, were betraying their crews. Panthers overheated. Fuel lines burst into flame. Tigers, too heavy for the soft ground, sank into the soil like monuments to arrogance. General Haas' radio crackled with reports. Broken tracks, destroyed bridges, stalled supply columns. Yet his orders were simple. Keep going. The attack could not stop. Inside one Tiger, Lieutenant Ernst Reichel squinted through his periscope. "We're blind," he shouted. Dust and smoke made it impossible to see. They fired anyway, shells vanishing into the haze. Somewhere ahead, a T-34 burst apart, but for every one destroyed, 2 more appeared from behind the ridges. "They came at us like ghosts," Reichel said. "We hit them again and again, but they kept coming." Behind the Soviet lines, Colonel Katakov watched through binoculars, calm and cold. His gunners had waited weeks for this. "Let them come closer," he ordered. When the Tigers appeared, the Russian guns roared. Small 45mm shells clanged uselessly against the thick armor, but others, hidden 76mm pieces, struck home. Smoke poured from German tanks. Everywhere, the same story repeated. German precision met Soviet preparation. The Red Army had turned every field into a killing ground. At dusk, the 4th Panzer Army reported only minor gains, barely 6 miles. Thousands of shells spent, hundreds of tanks damaged. Manstein insisted the advance would resume at dawn. "The enemy bleeds more than we do," he said. But in the trenches opposite, Soviet soldiers laughed bitterly. "Let him bleed," one gunner muttered. "We have more blood than he has tanks." The next day, the Germans tried again. The sun rose red through the smoke. Mechanics worked all night to patch holes and restart burned engines. The first units rolled out across the same ground already littered with wrecks. Crows circled overhead, their cries drowned by the roar of engines. In the south, the attack moved toward the village of Prokhorovka, just a name on a map, a small railway stop. But it would soon become the center of the storm. Soviet scouts had spotted the German buildup and radioed back. heavy armor massing, hundreds of tanks. Their commanders understood what was coming. On the far side of the fields, the 5th Guards Tank Army of General Rotmistrov took position. Thousands of T-34s were lined up, engines silent, crews waiting for the signal. Captain Ivan Grigoriev sat inside his tank, smoking in the dark. He could feel the ground trembling under his boots. "They're close," his gunner said. Grigoriev nodded. "Then we don't wait." Through the early morning mist, he saw them, shapes moving in formation, German crosses faintly visible on the armor. The Tigers and Panthers advanced, perfect and terrible. For a moment, the Soviet crew stared, awed by their size. Then came the order, low and steady. "For the motherland. Forward." Engines roared to life. Hundreds of T-34s surged out of the wheat fields, charging straight at the enemy. The shock was instant. German gunners swung their turrets frantically, trying to track the fast-moving shapes. Shells crisscrossed the sky. The air filled with the metallic scream of ricochets. A Soviet shell struck a Tiger square in the turret ring, an explosion of fire and debris. Another T-34 rammed a Panther head-on, both tanks bursting into flame. It was chaos, remembered a German crewman. No front, no rear, just machines colliding in a storm of steel. In his bunker miles away, Manstein received the first reports. Enemy armor counterattacking from the east. He looked at the map, his cigarette trembling slightly. "So," he said quietly, "they've decided to meet us face to face." He didn't yet know that this would become the largest armored clash in history, that the fate of his entire campaign, and perhaps of the war in the east, would be decided on that single stretch of burning ground. By nightfall, the air was thick with ash and the smell of molten iron. Both armies were locked together, unable to advance or retreat. The Germans had set out to break through in 3 days. Now, surrounded by fire and wreckage, they realized something far worse. The Red Army wasn't breaking. It was waiting for them to burn out. July 12, 1943. The sun had not yet risen, but the steppe already trembled. The sound was not thunder, it was engines. Hundreds of them. From both directions. By dawn, more than 1,200 tanks faced each other near the small railway station of Prokhorovka. On one side, the elite of the German army, the 2 SS Panzer Corps, divisions Leibstandard, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. On the other, General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, the Red Army's pride, gathered for one desperate charge. The air smelled of fuel and dust. Dew clung to the grass, soon to be turned into fire. Soviet crews sat inside their T-34s, engines rumbling softly, hands trembling on the controls. "When you see the crosses," their commanders had said, "drive straight at them." At 8:30 a.m., the sky cracked open with artillery. The first salvos landed among the German lines. Shells whistled overhead, exploding in geysers of dirt and smoke. Then came the roar, the Soviet counterattack. Hundreds of T-34s burst from behind the hills, engines screaming, guns blazing. They charged downhill toward the German positions like an avalanche of steel. The Germans had been ready. Their Tigers and Panthers waited in hull-down positions, guns already trained. The range was short, too short for comfort. "Fewer free," someone shouted. The first German shells tore through the Soviet ranks. One T-34 erupted in flame. Another plowed into a crater and vanished in a burst of dust. But the wave kept coming. "They came at us in swarms," wrote an SS officer from Leibstandard. The ground shook as if the earth itself had gone mad. At less than 200 meters, the two forces collided. Soviet tanks rammed German ones head-on, knowing they could not win a long-range duel. Steel scraped against steel, guns fired at point-blank range. Some tanks were destroyed so quickly that the crews never escaped, their screams lost under the thunder of engines and explosions. A Soviet commander remembered the moment his T-34 struck a Tiger. The world turned white. "I couldn't hear, couldn't breathe. When I opened my eyes, we were on fire, but we kept moving forward." By mid-morning, the battlefield had become an inferno. Smoke hung so thick that pilots above couldn't tell friend from foe. Artillery shells fell blindly into the chaos. Radio communication broke down. Both sides fought on instinct alone. One German tank commander described the scene. "Through the periscope, I saw nothing but flashes. Everything around me burned. I realized the front no longer existed, only survival. At noon, Soviet infantry joined the fray, running between burning tanks, hurling grenades into German armor. The ground was slick with oil and blood. The heat warped the air, turning the steppe into a shimmering mirage. From his observation post, General Rotmistrov watched the carnage unfold. There was no more command, he later wrote. Only the roar of battle. Our men fought until their tanks melted. By 2 p.m., Prokhorovka was a wasteland. Columns of smoke rose miles into the sky. Hundreds of tanks lay scattered, some still burning, others blackened shells cooling in the sun. Horses, trucks, and men lay twisted among them. The grass itself smoldered. When night finally fell, neither side claimed victory. The Germans had destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks, but failed to break through. The Red Army had stopped the advance, but at a terrible cost. Thousands were dead. A German survivor summed it up simply. It was not a battle. It was a slaughterhouse. In Moscow, Soviet radio called it a triumph. In Berlin, reports were quieter, uncertain. Hitler asked for results, for proof of breakthrough. None came. The myth of German invincibility was dying here, on this field of ashes. The next morning, the air still smelled of smoke and iron. Crows circled overhead. Soldiers from both armies wandered among wrecks, silent, dazed. One Soviet mechanic, staring at the blackened shell of his tank, whispered, "We lived through hell, and hell is still burning." In the ruins of Prokhorovka, the truth was already clear. Blitzkrieg was dead. The Wehrmacht had thrown its best against the Red Army, and the steppe had swallowed it whole. But as the fires died out, another battle began, one not of tanks and shells, but of memory, propaganda, and pride. The war had turned. And from this moment, the question was no longer if Germany would lose, only how long it could delay the inevitable. By midday, the heat inside the tanks had become unbearable. Steel turned into an oven. Crews tore open their shirts, gasping for air that smelled of smoke and metal. Thermometers on the control panels showed nearly 60 degrees Celsius. Men were fainting at their posts, but the orders were clear. Hold your ground. No retreat. The battlefield south of Prokhorovka was no longer a place of strategy. It was a furnace of chaos. The ground, once golden with wheat, was now black and cracked. Between the smoking hulks of Tigers and T-34s, oil fires burned blue against the wind. The roar of engines mixed with the dull thud of distant artillery. German engineers tried to reach damaged tanks under constant Soviet shelling. A recovery crew attached a cable to a crippled Panther, only for a shell to hit nearby, shredding the men into the mud. Their commander turned away. "Leave it," he said quietly. "There's nothing left to save." Fuel was running out. Ammunition, too. Radio chatter from the German lines grew desperate. "We are surrounded by wrecks. No fuel left for evacuation. Request permission to abandon vehicles." The reply came cold and formal. "Negative. Orders remain unchanged." Above, the Luftwaffe tried to stem the tide. Squadrons of Stukas dove through the smoke, sirens wailing, bombs tearing open the steppe. But the Soviet anti-aircraft guns were waiting. Black puffs of flak filled the sky, tearing into the German planes before they could climb away. Pilots who bailed out landed in burning fields. None returned. On the ground, the Red Army struck again and again. Their T-34s appeared like phantoms through the haze, fast, nimble, deadly. They moved in coordinated packs, flanking from the edges, hitting supply trucks, slicing through isolated pockets of resistance. For every tank the Germans destroyed, 3 more emerged from the east. Soviet radio intercepts told the story clearly. The Germans were crumbling. Their once proud panzers stood immobilized, either out of fuel or buried in craters. "The beast is bleeding," a Soviet artillery officer said, watching the flames through binoculars. "Now we finish it." One Red Army tank crew became legend that afternoon. Their T-34, already hit twice, limped into a gully where 3 Tigers waited. With their main gun jammed, the commander ordered ramming speed. The first Tiger fired and missed. The T-34 smashed into its side, the explosion engulfing both. The Soviet tank kept burning forward, rolling straight into the second Tiger before the ammunition inside finally ignited. Hours later, rescuers found only the mechanic alive. half-burned, delirious, still gripping the controls. When asked what happened, he muttered, "We didn't stop." Elsewhere, the German command post fell silent. The reports arriving from every sector sounded the same: losses, exhaustion, chaos. Mechanics worked without tools, scavenging parts from corpses of machines. Crews fought until their guns jammed, then fled under the cover of smoke. Manstein, far from the front, stared at the maps spread before him. His plan, Citadel, was collapsing in real time. What had begun as a promise of redemption after Stalingrad was now dissolving in dust and blood. "We underestimated them again," one aide whispered. Manstein didn't answer. He simply drew his finger along the map, over the black lines that had once marked victory, now only graves. Across the field, Soviet commanders walked among the wrecks, counting none of it as glory. They found tanks still hot, with burned men inside, hands fused to controls. "They fought hard," one officer said. "Too hard." He lit a cigarette and stared into the smoke. "But it ends here." The steppe that day smelled of death and gasoline. Flies gathered on the cooling steel. The cries of the wounded were drowned by the distant rumble of fresh Soviet batteries moving forward. The Red Army was not celebrating. It was preparing for the next blow. In the evening, as the sun sank behind the burning horizon, German radio signals grew fewer and fainter. Some units didn't respond at all. Others sent their final message: "We hold nothing. We are finished." The Soviet advance paused only to reload. The commanders knew what the silence meant. "They're broken," said General Vatutin. "Now it's time to bury the pieces." But while his guns roared again, far away in Berlin, another voice was speaking, a voice that would decide the fate of every soldier still trapped in the burning steppe. Because even as the last tigers fought to the death, Hitler was already reaching for the telephone. And with one order, he would end not just the battle, but Germany's last hope of victory. July 13, 1943. In a smoky command bunker outside Zaporizhzhia, a single telegram arrived from Berlin. It was short, coded, final: "Cease offensive operations. Redeploy forces to Italy immediately." For a moment, no one spoke. The officers around Manstein stared at the message as if it were a mistake. Italy? Their divisions were bleeding on the steppe, surrounded by Soviet armor, and Berlin wanted them to move south? Manstein took off his glasses, rubbed his temples, and said quietly, "He's lost his nerve." Hitler had received news that Allied forces had landed in Sicily. To him, it was a second front, his worst nightmare. In panic, he ordered reserves from the east to defend Europe's soft underbelly. What he didn't realize, or didn't care to admit, was that pulling tanks from Kursk meant tearing the spine out of Operation Citadel. Manstein tried to protest. "My Führer, we are close to breaking them. One more push, and the salient will collapse." His voice cracked through the static of the field telephone. Hitler's reply came cold and distant. "The war will be decided in the West, not in the Russian mud." And just like that, the largest offensive in the East was over. In the field headquarters of the 4th Panzer Army, the order struck like a hammer. Officers looked at one another in disbelief. The maps they had pored over for months, the plans, the dreams of redemption after Stalingrad, all meaningless. Major Gerhard Bremer of Leibstandard, SS, stood in silence as his men packed up the last crates of ammunition. "So that's it," one soldier said bitterly. "We die here so someone else can drown in the Mediterranean." Out on the front lines, the guns did not know the war had changed. Soviet artillery still hammered the ridges. Tank crews still fought for each yard of burning soil. But the German offensive had lost its purpose. Their fuel convoys were already being rerouted. Their reinforcements would never arrive. That night, Manstein burned the operation maps himself. The flames reflected off his glasses as he watched the paper curl into ash. "We almost had it," he whispered. Almost. The next morning, Soviet reconnaissance planes reported something strange. Fewer German columns moving forward, more moving back. At first, Moscow thought it was deception. Then came intercepted radio messages, requests for evacuation, coordinates for fallback positions. Stalin was informed personally. He listened without expression, then said only 2 words: "Begin Kutuzov." The Red Army moved instantly. From north and south, massive counterattacks erupted, waves of tanks, artillery, and infantry rolling into the exhausted German lines. At Panayrai, Soviet troops stormed the trenches the Wehrmacht had taken days to capture. At Belgorod, entire panzer divisions found themselves cut off from supply. "They hit us everywhere," a German radio operator wrote in his log before his signal went silent. Amid the chaos, a final act of defiance unfolded. In the ruins near Prokhorovka, the last Tiger of the Leibstandard division ran out of fuel. Its commander, Captain Fritz Müller, ordered his crew to hold the line anyway. They loaded the gun by hand and fired until the breech jammed. When Soviet tanks closed in, Müller gave a quiet order: "Set her ablaze." The crew climbed out and watched their steel giant burn, a funeral pyre for the entire operation. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, morale surged. Tank columns roared forward through smoke and flame, crushing abandoned German positions under their treads. "They're running," a Soviet gunner shouted. "The fascists are running." In Berlin, Hitler's generals tried to make sense of it. Field Marshal Keitel muttered, "We've stopped our attack to start losing again." But no one dared question the Führer. The irony was brutal. The Germans had launched Citadel to regain initiative on the Eastern Front. Instead, Hitler's decision handed that initiative to the enemy forever. By July 15th, the once proud spearheads of the Wehrmacht were retreating through their own wreckage. Supply trucks burned by the roadside. Tank crews rode on the hulls of their empty machines, staring silently at the horizon. A German officer wrote home, "We don't retreat by command anymore. We retreat because we have nothing left." In the villages behind the front, Soviet peasants watched the German columns withdraw, their boots caked with dust, their faces gray. No cheers followed, only the distant rumble of approaching Soviet guns. That night, as Manstein left his bunker, he heard the faint echo of artillery rolling across the steppe. It sounded like the closing of a great door, the door to victory, the door he would never open again. Far away, in the Kremlin, Stalin looked at a map marked with red arrows stretching westward. "Let him go," he said. "We'll chase him all the way to Berlin." And while Hitler obsessed over the Mediterranean, the Red Army began to move, slowly, relentlessly, toward the heart of Europe. The offensive that was supposed to restore Germany's power had instead revealed its limits. And for the men still stranded on the fields of Kursk, the truth was now undeniable. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. July 15th, 1943. The first thunder of Soviet artillery broke the dawn like a storm returning from the dead. Thousands of guns opened fire at once, a rolling wall of sound that shook the steppe for miles. The counterattack had begun. The sky turned red before sunrise. Over the smoldering ruins of Kursk, Soviet shells rained down on retreating German lines. Kutuzov, the operation was called, a name chosen deliberately. The same general who had once driven Napoleon from Russia would now chase out the Germans. Columns of T-34s pushed forward through the smoke, their tracks crushing the wrecks of Panthers and Tigers left behind. Infantry followed close behind, stepping through shell holes and over twisted steel. The ground was black and soft, soaked with oil, blood, and melted metal. On the German side, the situation was collapsing faster than anyone could contain it. Entire regiments were withdrawing without orders. Trucks broke down. Radio links failed. Commanders shouted into silence. "Where are the reinforcements?" one colonel demanded. The answer came back flat. "There are none." At Orel, the northern flank, Soviet armor hit first, hundreds of tanks advancing behind a curtain of smoke. German anti-tank crews fought until their barrels glowed red, until the recoil smashed their shoulders raw. Still, the T-34s came on. "They move like a tide," one Wehrmacht officer wrote. "You stop one wave, another follows." In the south, Vatutin's and Rotmistrov's armies advanced toward Belgorod and Kharkov. Soviet aviation ruled the skies now. Il-2 Sturmovix swept in low, firing rockets into German columns. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but its pilots faced a new reality. For the first time on the Eastern Front, the Red Air Force outnumbered them. From a distance, the battlefield looked like a moving storm. Black plumes, orange flashes, a trembling horizon. Inside it, men fought hand-to-hand in the ruins of villages that had changed hands 5 times in a week. A Soviet private recalled, "We didn't count tanks anymore. We didn't count days. We just pushed west." As the Red Army advanced, Soviet propaganda called it revenge for Kursk. But for the soldiers, it felt simpler: survival, momentum, purpose. "Every meter forward," said one officer, "means one less night under their shells." The Germans tried to organize a defense along the Desna River, but their armor was gone, their fuel nearly empty. Panthers sat abandoned by the roadside, engines dry. In the ditches, wounded soldiers waited for ambulances that never came. "We have nothing left," one SS sergeant wrote in his diary. No fuel, no friends, no faith. By late July, the Soviet push had become unstoppable. Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Reminiscent in the south crushed what remained of Army Group Center and the 4th Panzer Army. The Wehrmacht, once the predator of the steppe, now bled across its own tracks. At Belgorod, the fighting lasted 3 days. When the city finally fell, Soviet tanks rolled through streets littered with helmets and broken signs in German. A radio operator in Moscow announced the victory, and for the first time in months, the bells of the Kremlin rang. Farther south, Kharkov burned again. It had changed hands 4 times since 1941. This time, it would not return to German control. When the red flag rose above its ruins in August, the Eastern Front itself seemed to shift. The tide had turned. For the men who had fought at Kursk, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. They walked among the smoking hulks that dotted the horizon, thousands of burned-out tanks from both sides. "You could smell the metal," one veteran said later. It wasn't the smell of victory. It was the smell of death that kept moving west. In the command post of the 9th Army, General Model looked over his reports in silence. He knew what they meant. The German army would never again launch a large-scale offensive in the east. The war from now on would be defense, a slow, grinding retreat. The Soviet generals knew it too. "They've lost their teeth," said Zhukov. "Now we break their bones." And so, under a blazing summer sun, the Red Army pushed forward, kilometer by kilometer, across fields that still burned from the battle that had begun it all. At night, the soldiers could still see the glow of the fires behind them, the last flames of Kursk, reflected in their eyes like a warning. The war was not over. It was changing shape. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht lay buried beneath that scorched soil. And in its place rose something else, a new certainty that the Red Army would not stop again until it reached Berlin. The thunder that had begun at dawn was still echoing far into the distance. It no longer sounded like artillery. It sounded like the footsteps of an army that had learned it could win. A week after the fires of Kursk began to fade, reconnaissance planes from the Western Allies brought back photographs from the Eastern Front. Across the cracked soil of southern Russia, thousands of black scars stretched for miles, wrecked tanks, burned trenches, and long trails of retreating columns. In a quiet office in London, an American intelligence officer looked at the images and whispered, "They did it. Hitler won't attack again." The Battle of Kursk was over. What began as Germany's desperate bid to regain momentum had ended as the final proof that momentum was gone. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was now a defensive army, limping west under skies it no longer controlled. On the steppe, the air still smelled of oil and ash. Soviet engineers moved through the ruins, collecting twisted fragments of armor, cataloging serial numbers from Panther turrets and Tiger hulls. Reporters from Pravda wrote about the victory of the people's will, but the soldiers who had survived knew the price. One sergeant, his face gray from exhaustion, said quietly to a correspondent, "We won because we had no other choice." The numbers told their own story. Nearly 3,000 German tanks destroyed, 200,000 men lost, half of the Luftwaffe's frontline strength shattered. And though the Red Army's casualties were even higher, they could replace them. The Germans could not. By August, Soviet divisions were pushing toward the Dnieper. In Berlin, the generals spoke in coded despair. "Citadel has failed," one report admitted. "The enemy now dictates the rhythm of the war." Hitler refused to read it. He sat for hours over maps that no longer represented reality, tracing lines that were already broken in the field. For the soldiers who had fought in the battle, memory blurred into silence. One German gunner later wrote, "After Kursk, we stopped believing in victory. We only believed in surviving." In contrast, a Soviet lieutenant described it as a rebirth. "Before Kursk, we feared their tanks. After Kursk, we hunted them." In the West, Allied leaders understood the shift instantly. Churchill called Kursk the turning point on which the hinge of fate swung. Roosevelt's advisors wrote that Germany's strength was bleeding out through the Russian plain. In secret meetings, planners in London began discussing a new idea, one that would soon have a name: Operation Overlord. The ripples from Kursk stretched across the globe. The Red Army's advance forced Germany to shift divisions from France and the Balkans, weakening its defenses for the coming storm in the west. The balance of the entire war had changed in a matter of weeks. But on the ground, under the endless Russian sky, the aftermath felt quieter, heavier. Villagers emerged from cellars to find their homes leveled, their fields scorched. The steppe was littered with the dead of both armies, lying side by side in the same black soil. Local peasants buried them without distinction. They had seen too much to care about uniforms. By September, the grass had begun to grow back over the battlefield. Children herding cows stumbled upon the rusting hulks of tanks, their guns still pointing at the horizon. For decades, the farmers would plow up fragments of that summer: links of track, burned helmets, human bones fused with steel. One Soviet historian visiting the site years later wrote, "There was a strange peace here, as if the earth itself remembered and chose not to speak." Back in Moscow, celebrations filled Red Square. Stalin watched from the Kremlin balcony as fireworks burst above the city, a signal to the world that the tide had turned. But even as the crowds cheered, his advisors noticed his silence. He knew the war was far from over. There would be Kiev, Warsaw, and finally Berlin, each step costing more lives. Yet after Kursk, there was no more doubt about the direction. The myth of the German Blitzkrieg, of an army that could not be stopped, had died in the fields of southern Russia. From now on, it would be retreat, defense, and surrender. For the men who had lived through those days, the memory of Kursk never left. One veteran wrote decades later, "The sound of tank engines at dawn still wakes me. I can smell the oil, feel the ground shaking. I see the smoke rising and think, this is where the war truly changed." Today, the fields around Prokhorovka are quiet again. The soil is dark, fertile, and heavy. Beneath it lie thousands of tanks and men, German, Soviet, known, unknown. The wind moves through the grass, whispering over their graves. If you stand there at dusk, you can almost hear it, the echo of that summer's fury fading into the horizon, the silence that follows when history shifts. Hitler had wanted a single blow that would change the course of the war. He got it, but it was not his victory. It was the moment his empire began to die.